Welcome everybody to our session for Devtoberfest. We have dubbed this session Extending Your On-Premise OData Entities in CAP, which is very imaginative and rather descriptive, I would say. So that is exactly what we're going to try and accomplish. My name is Jorg by introduction. I've been a developer for quite a long time. I do BTP and CAP for a living and Fiori as well. This is a QR code to our LinkedIn profiles. I have with me here Ketan.
Hello, yep, I'm Ketan Patel, and I'm working alongside Jorg. Been in the game for a long time now as a developer and architect. And again, focused on BTP and CAP and all of that for the past 2 years now. And it's a good journey.
All right, thanks. Well, that's I believe enough about us. So let's talk about what we're actually doing. So I want to talk a little bit about the use case I had, which brought about the topic that we're discussing at the moment. So I have a fairly large collection of applications. They're now part of Industry Cloud. I think it's 40 components. Multiple customers have these applications installed. Traditionally, they ran off the SAP Gateway, so the on-premise SAP Gateway. And underneath all of these components sit a collection of OData services, the majority of which are still kind of old school, I would say. So they're made of dynamic select statements where you try to take the top and skip into account and the selection parameters and the columns. And, if you've been there 10 years ago, you've probably made these services. So we have been wondering how to take that because it's part of an industry solution. It's not super straightforward to get things out. So half of these are standard SAP and standard industry solution data, but other parts of it are completely made up to support our solution. So that includes Z tables, Z domains, Z fields, extensions on standard tables, and not all of it needs to be there. So when we started considering what we would do to migrate this to BTP and do our little part on keeping the core clean, it was pretty easy to move the Fiori applications to just Fiori applications. So that migration didn't take very long and it ran off of WorkZone. Right? But then you still have all of the OData services that sit underneath. And you can make changes that are fairly simple to make where you extend the service, but they change the OData service. And I have a lot of UI5 applications to support. This is all freestyle stuff. So I want to make my life easier in terms of development time and regression testing by not changing the underlying OData entity. Which is why I started thinking about extending the on-premise entity with fields that are persisted somewhere else. So that's a bit about the use case. So then while I started doing that and going through a bit of a proof of concept, I started thinking, why is this worthy of discussion? Why am I talking about this? So I found out that while you can extend the CDS entity, the implementation is not always straightforward, like at all. The extension is there in seconds, but then everything else kind of starts falling apart. And I think it's worth talking about because you can piece by piece, field by field, you can start to move your OData services out of your on-premise systems and into cloud databases and cloud hosted solutions. Which reduces risk by isolating extensions, follow the clean core strategy, and all of these things. It also means you can iterate faster. You don't need to test the on-premise data. You just need to test the field that you added in an isolated environment, essentially. So I thought that was worth a conversation with all of you. So for today's demo, we have a link to the GitHub repository that we created. Here's a QR code as well if you want to follow along or have a look. I'll bring it up myself because it is a interesting repository. So here's our Devtoberfest 2024. It is a CAP application, obviously. Now, we don't have an on-premise OData entity we can easily demo for these kind of purposes, nor can we expect anybody to follow along with an on-premise extension of mine, right? So instead, we paid some homage to the predecessor for Devtoberfest, and we decided to extend the admin beer shop endpoint that Gregor made a few years ago. It's still running, so all is well. And I think with that, no, I forget. There's a README, a really good one that Ketan produced. It should be straightforward enough to try this at home without having to muck about too much on how to run something or how to host something. So there's a whole guide in here on what to do. Right, so if you want to follow along, please do. Or if you want to try this later, you're invited to clone it and have a crack. All right, now it's time to do some coding. Over to you, Ketan.
Awesome. Thank you, Jorg. So, yes, absolutely. Piggybacking off that, we want to take the beer shop CAP application that we have, in particular the beer shop admin service for V4, and we want to extend that to incorporate some of our custom attributes. Coming into the application here, you can see that it's got some basic information about some of the beers, but not really enough of the pertinent information that we need to make our beer review application to help our customers decide what type of beer. So what we'd like to do is extend that to incorporate some new attributes for the style, a bit of a description about the beer itself, and also a strength rating, which is kind of a useful guide for our customers who've got a view around whether they want to buy low strength beer or mid strength beer, etc. So what we've done, if I jump into our CAP application that we've got here, I've got that running currently in the terminal. So I've got two, as you'll see here in the terminal, we've got both applications running. So in order to run this demo, as you mentioned before, we need to have the PG Beer Shop running, and that needs to be running on port 4005. And then in a separate terminal, we've also got our custom extension application running also. The first piece, as you mentioned, when we started building this out, is we needed to make sure we import the definition of the beer shop admin service. So we kick off by importing the schema definition from the metadata for that service into our project. Next thing we do is we ran the CDS import definition API to convert the metadata into a CDS definition that we can then reference within our CAP application. So it creates this additional file here, which is effectively a CDS definition of the same metadata for that OData service. In addition to that, it adds a definition for the particular file in our package.json. So now with this definition, we can programmatically to refer to the service in our CAP application. So you can see here, it defines the type, kind as OData, and it provides a reference to the model file that we've just generated. In addition to that, we also need to provide credentials for that application, where we provide the URL and details of authentication. Now, as you can see here, we've got a reference to the application running on localhost on port 4005. As I mentioned before, if you're not running it on 4005, the demo will not work. So you need to make sure that it is running on that. In addition to that, the PG service is set up for basic authentication. So we pass the user credentials, which is in this case, the user Alice with no password, to that service when proxying any of those service calls. This will make sure that the service authenticates appropriately and then passes the details back. So without this, the service calls would fail. Now, I do want to draw your attention to this because this is not how you would set up an app productively. It's there purely for reference for local development, and you should be using a destination when you are when you're setting this up productively. With that, now we can start to build out our CAP application. So the first thing that we need to do is to create our database schema definition. So as you can see here, under the DB directory, we've got our file schema.cds, and within here, we've got a reference to the BeerShop service running in the PG BeerShop. And what we want to do is we want to take that definition, which we've created as an alias external, and we want to extend that, in particular the entity beers, and add our custom attributes. Now I want to draw your attention to the concept that we're using here. So we're using an aspect here to capture all of the custom properties that we wanted to add to that entity. So you can see here, as I mentioned before, for us, we wanted to add about, style, and then we've got here a virtual properties that's not persisted. It's just a calculated field to determine the strength rating. And in addition to that, we've got our custom entity, which will reside within our CAP application and with a reference to a database table we're going to create, which is ID with a key ID, which is of string type. Now, this ID is a reference to the ID of the ID for the beers in the beer shop. And that's how we can correlate the IDs in the beer shop with the IDs for the extension, data we've stored locally. In addition to that, we have to support our local development. We've got some custom data we've created here in a CSV file, where we've taken each of the IDs from each of the beers in the demo service for the PG beer shop, and we've added in the style and also our description. And you'll note that we have not included, obviously, the strength because that's the virtual attribute, so we don't have any need for that. And with that, now we've created our data definition for the database. We now need to expose that as a service. To do that, we create our service.cds file. And within here, again, we make reference to our external definition, which is to the BeerShop admin service. And as you can see here, we've got an extension projection on the beers entity within that. And that's really important because when you create your CDS here for your service, you've got two options. You've got a select and you've got as a projection. And the difference between that is in a projection, there's no explicit join supported and there's no explicit unions, which means that it's the perfect use case for extending an OData service. Now, supplementary to that, now we've got our service definition as a CDS. We need to incorporate some additional handlers to manage executing those services. So if I come across to our service.cds file here, this is where we've created, our service.js file. This is where we've created our handler for the services. So in here, you can see here we've got our class here, which extends the dev, is an extension of the application service, which is a reference to the devtober service. So the name of the service has to match the service in your CDS file. The first thing we do when service initializes is we connect to the BeerShop service, in the Postgres BeerShop service, in particular the BeerShop admin service. And this is a reference to the same file that we had, to the same service we've had in the package.json. So here, when we connect to it, this is what the actual connection detail is pulling for the type of service that it's going to generate. And then one final piece is required to kind of hook everything together. So scroll down to the bottom, we've got one handler that we've created in here. Now, this handler is set up to handle any operation over any entity in that service and pass the query context and execute that in the PG BeerShop service and return the results there. So what that means is now we can finally proxy all of our requests from this application into our PG BeerShop application. So if we go ahead and attempt to run it, do is bring the two applications side by side. So this on the right hand side is our custom application that's been extended. So if I run breweries in the beer shop admin service, and I've got breweries here. You can see that the data is the same. Now, if I attempt to run the beer shop service, however, we get an error message. And there's a complaint. Oh dear, strength does not exist in type beers. And that's because the strength does not exist in the beer service. And if we come back here and we take a look at the client, and we can see here in the PG beer shop that a request was made, which included our custom attributes for strength, style, and about. And these do not exist in the service. So this is a problem. We can't just proxy any request across because we need to make sure that we handle those custom fields. So what we've done is we've created custom handlers to accommodate for this. And this is where it's really important to use the aspects, because that helps us to differentiate between what was included from the original service and what we've added as part of our extension. So now if I save this, that'll reload the service. And if I go back to our service and hit refresh, there we go. So you can now see that the service returns, and we've got our custom attributes for brewery ID, strength, style, and about come through in the service. And if we compare that to the, I'm going to start from here. So comparing the two sides side by side, you can now see that we've got the brewery ID, the strength, the style, and the about, compared to the original service, which just has the ABV, the IBU, and the brewery ID. So how do we manage this? What we did was we need to make sure that we're able to distinguish between the attributes we extended and the original service. So the first part, as the service initializes, we pull out the excluded fields and the valid fields. So if we restart the service in terms of the Devtoberfest app, you can see here we've logged the original excluded fields, which are the attributes from our aspect. And originally we've got the original valid fields, which are the ID, the name, the ABV, IBU, brewery, and brewery ID. Using these in the read handler, we're now able to rewrite the query to modify it to extract only the elements that are pertinent to the Postgres beer shop service. And what that allows us to do is to then run the query only for the attributes required. So coming here, this is the first part where we effectively rewrite the from statement and then rebuild the query. So here we include the from, and then subsequently, as we come down to this section, we break out the query parts. So given that when you are performing a read operation, you can do a read entity or a read entity set, you need to have a little bit of nuanced handling. In here, for example, you can see here for a single entity, we want to only pass the columns that are required for the entity. However, for an entity, for S entity set, we want to make sure we incorporate the where clause, the order by, the columns, and the count if they've been propagated across in the original query. We then run that in against the backend service, the PG set admin service, and return the data set. Using the data set, we're now able to extend that data. So again, with that nuance around handling for an entity set versus an entity, we need to accommodate updating the return data with the additional attributes from our extension data. So in the first part here, we're checking whether or not the response is for an array. As it is, or if it is, then what we do is we identify all the IDs from that entity set that's been returned, and we run a query to our backend database and pull back all the extension data. we then use a map and update each of the records, adding our extension data that we read from the database. And in addition to that, we've got a separate handler for a custom method we've written to determine the strength based on the ABV of the beer from the PG admin service. In correlation to that, or in addition to that, we've also got the additional handler, which is for a select single. And again, the key difference here is really just updating the data directly to the data set for a single record. Once that's done, we return back the data to the Postgres set, to the service, and that's handed back to the client. Cool. Handing over to you, Jorgen.
All right, thanks, Katin. That was very enlightening. I think we showed what the goal is with extending a service by including and excluding fields. Now, do I know if that is the correct approach or the only approach? No, I'm not entirely sure, but it's the one that ended up working for us. So this does allow me to go through my old services one by one and add fields to the aspect. And as long as the fields are in the aspect, the table will update, the service will fetch them from the right spot, and all the other things that afterwards doesn't need any more specific handling unless your fields have special considerations, such as Katin's strength virtual field or status field or something like that. But by and large, you should be able to remove a field from one entity and add it to the other, and it should keep being in sync. Now, would I take this approach if I didn't have a large Fiori application to support? Maybe it might have been easier to just make an association, but then I need to change all my Fiori applications. So that has drawbacks. I'm also not sure if there would, what kind of issues may arise from doing these kind of query pass-throughs to V2 services. So far, I haven't really noticed anything, but I have noticed that you can use this technique to, convert a service from V2 into V4. I can now build a Elements application on top of a V2 service, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I did a proof of concept putting annotations on this and passing it straight off to my old school app, and it worked. I thought it was an interesting side effect. Our friend Lochner suggested an alternative by keeping the association but creating a view on top of it and normalizing that into the same structure. I thought about that approach as well, but that means I need to still maintain fields in two places. I need to maintain the view and I need to maintain the association. And I decided that this was more flexible, but it seems like a good approach too. I think that takes us to the end of a presentation. I'm pretty sure we're just about out of time anyway. So I have really not much else to say, but thank you very much for listening. If you have any suggestions on how to handle this particular situation, I'm all ears. And if you found it helpful, send us a line. The slide pack and the GitHub will have our contact information in it. So thanks for listening. I hope you had a good time with it.